What if I told you that the most desperate thing you can do is try to be understood, not ignored, not rejected, but understood? At first, that sounds almost absurd, like it contradicts everything you've ever been taught about relationships, communication, and connection. After all, we grow up hearing that clarity is everything, that if something goes wrong, it's because we didn't explain ourselves well enough, that if someone misunderstands us, the solution is simple. Try harder, say more, be more transparent, more available, more open. But beneath that familiar narrative lies something far more complex and far more uncomfortable. Because the truth is, the more you feel the urge to explain yourself, the more likely it is that you are no longer grounded in who you are. Instead, you are reacting. You are trying to stabilize something that feels like it's slipping away. And that something is not the other person. It's your own sense of self. Think about a moment that feels familiar. You send a message. It could be simple, casual, even light. You don't think much of it at first. But then, silence. Minutes pass. Then more. You check your phone again. Still nothing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift inside you. Your breathing changes. Your thoughts start multiplying. What was once neutral becomes charged with meaning. Did I say something wrong? Was I too much? Should I explain what I meant? And before you even notice the transition, you are no longer calm. You are activated. That activation is the key, because in that moment, you are not just waiting for a reply. You are confronting a psychological void, and the discomfort of that void is so intense that your mind rushes to fill it. You begin to construct narratives, possibilities, fears. And then comes the impulse, the urge to act, to fix, to reach out again. Another message, a clarification, maybe a long paragraph where you lay everything out, hoping that if you just say it the right way, everything will return to normal. But here is the deeper reality. You are not trying to communicate. You are trying to repair a version of yourself that now feels damaged in someone else's perception. You are trying to restore an image, and that image is not even fully yours. It is the version of you that you believe exists in the mind of the other person. This is why it feels so urgent, so emotional, so difficult to resist, because it is not about the message. It is about identity. Carl Jung explored this phenomenon with remarkable precision. He described how the human psyche is not a unified, stable entity, but a dynamic system composed of different parts, many of them unconscious. One of these parts is what he called the persona. The persona is the social mask we wear. It is not inherently false, but it is selective. It is a version of ourselves that we present to the world in order to function, to belong, to be accepted. The problem begins when we start to identify too strongly with that mask, when our sense of worth becomes tied to how that persona is received by others. Because then any disruption, any misunderstanding, any lack of response feels like a threat to our very existence. And that is when another force enters the scene, what Jung called a complex. A complex is not just a thought or an emotion. It is an entire network of feelings, memories, and unconscious associations that can take control of your behavior. When a complex is activated, you don't simply feel something. You become it. Your reactions intensify. Your perspective narrows. Your ability to remain grounded diminishes. And in that state, the need to explain yourself becomes overwhelming. So when you send that second message, that third message, that long explanation, it is not a rational decision. It is a psychological compulsion. You are trying to regain stability by controlling how you are perceived. You are trying to secure your place in the other person's mind. But the more you do this, the more you reinforce a dangerous pattern. The belief that your sense of self depends on external validation. This is where silence enters, not as absence, but as a radical act of psychological realignment. Because choosing not to react, choosing not to explain, choosing not to chase forces you confront what is happening internally. It removes the distraction. It eliminates the illusion of control. And suddenly, you are left with yourself. Jung referred to this shift as a withdrawal projection. Most people spend their lives projecting, placing their fears, desires, expectations, and insecurities onto others. They interpret behavior through the lens of their own unconscious material. And then they try to manage those external situations in order to regulate their internal state. That is why they explain. That is why they chase. That is why they cannot tolerate being misunderstood. Because if the other person sees them incorrectly, it feels like reality itself is unstable. But when you choose silence, you interrupt this entire mechanism. You stop trying to control the mirror. You stop adjusting yourself to fit someone else's perception. And instead, you begin the much more difficult process of turning inward. You begin to ask, what is actually being triggered in me right now? What am I afraid of? What part of me feels threatened? And if you're starting to recognize yourself in this pattern, if something here feels uncomfortably accurate, then this is exactly the kind of depth worth exploring further. Because real transformation doesn't come from surface-level tips or quick fixes. It comes from understanding the structure of your own mind. So if this resonates, staying engaged with this kind of reflection can genuinely change how you relate to yourself and to others. Now, it's important to understand that the real danger of chasing is not rejection. Rejection in itself is painful, but it is not destructive. What becomes destructive is what happens internally when you respond to rejection by abandoning yourself. Every time you beg for clarity, every time you try to force connection, every time you explain yourself to someone who is already withdrawn, you are sending a message to your unconscious. I am not enough as I am. I need them to confirm my value. And over time, that message becomes a belief, a deep, ingrained assumption that your stability depends on something outside of you. This is how psychological dependency is formed. This is how you begin to hand over the authority of your inner world to other people. Their attention becomes your validation. Their silence becomes your anxiety. Their presence becomes your sense of worth. This is not connection. This is captivity. However, not all silence is the same, and this distinction is crucial. There's a form of silence that is defensive, passive-aggressive, designed to punish or manipulate. This kind of silence is not rooted in strength, but in unresolved emotion. Then there's another form of silence that comes from emptiness, a kind of shutdown where a person disconnects entirely, not out of clarity, but out of exhaustion or resignation. But there's a third form, and this is where the real transformation lies: individuated silence. This is not silence as avoidance. It is silence as presence. It is the ability to remain grounded within yourself without the need to immediately react, explain, or justify. It carries a different kind of energy, one that does not seek approval, but also does not resist connection. It simply exists, stable and self-contained. This kind of silence communicates something profound, even without words. I know who I am, regardless of whether you understand me. It is not loud. It does not demand attention, but it has weight, and that weight changes how you move through the world. When you begin to embody this, several shifts occur. You stop over-explaining yourself to people who are not truly listening. You conserve energy that was previously dissipated in endless attempts to be seen. You begin to observe rather than react. And slowly, your sense of identity starts to move inward, becoming less dependent on external feedback. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. It is the integration of different parts of your psyche into a more stable, coherent self. And paradoxically, as you stop chasing validation, you become more grounded, more present, and often more attractive. Not because you're trying to be, but because you are no longer fragmented. To practice this in daily life requires awareness. The next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, pause. Notice the sensation in your body. Notice the thoughts that arise. Instead of acting immediately, allow that tension to exist. This is what Jung described as holding the tension of opposites, the ability to remain present without collapsing into action or avoidance. Then ask yourself honestly, what part of me is activated right now? Is it fear of rejection? Fear of being misunderstood? A desire to control how I am perceived? Bringing this into awareness already begins to shift the dynamic. From there, consciously withdraw your energy, not by cutting the other person off, but by releasing the internal dependency. Bring your attention back to yourself, and then do something that may feel unfamiliar. Give yourself what you were about to seek externally: validation, understanding, recognition. This is not self-deception. It is self-responsibility. At the same time, Your environment matters. You cannot cultivate this level of awareness in a space filled with constant noise, pressure, and emotional demand. Jung spoke about the idea of a protected inner space, a psychological sanctuary. This is something you must actively create, both internally and externally. Pay attention to the people in your life. Notice who respects your silence and who demands constant explanation. Notice who seeks to understand and who seeks to control. Setting boundaries in this context does not require confrontation or drama. It requires clarity and consistency. Because every time you choose not to over-explain, you reinforce a new internal standard that your existence does not require constant justification. However, there is an important caution. Silence must not become an escape. It must not be used to avoid difficult conversations, emotional honesty, or genuine intimacy. True silence is not about withdrawing from life. It is about engaging with it from a place of inner stability rather than reactivity. It allows for connection, but it does not depend on it to define your worth. In the end, your silence is not a wall. It is a space. A space where you are no longer performing, no longer adjusting yourself to meet external expectations, no longer chasing reflections of who you think you should be. It is a space where you can encounter yourself directly without distortion. You do not need to chase, because what is aligned with you will not require you to abandon yourself to keep it. You do not need to beg, because your value is not something that can be negotiated or proven through explanation. And you do not need to explain yourself endlessly, because truth does not depend on being constantly validated. Like the sun, it does not argue with the darkness. It simply shines. And now, take a moment to reflect honestly. Where in your life do you feel the strongest urge to explain yourself? Where do you feel misunderstood? And why does that feel so threatening? That is where your work begins. And the deeper you are willing to go into that question, the more you begin to reclaim something that was never truly lost, yourself.